Hello, everyone. We're back with another podcast for you. This week, we are looking at the West and really thinking about sort of rights as a moral concept and rights-based theories, or how rights fit into other theories. So
the Allman essay was interesting on rights. That I felt like I didn't even understand what rights are as I was reading it, or I misunderstood what I thought rights were. So could you?
Yeah, let's talk about it a little bit. So the Allman piece is really good, and those of you who were in the grad section read the Sumner piece. It's covering a lot of the same ground, but sometimes from a different perspective, and sometimes it's doing some stuff that's a little different. Rights are kind of not late in the sense of like the history of human beings, but late in terms of like lots of other moral concepts and theories. As Allman notes and Sumner notes, they really come about really just, a few hundred years ago. And they are really interesting things. So part of why I think they're interesting as an ethicist, as a philosopher, is, they're kind of like moral vocabulary or moral notion that really you might think can apply to lots of ethical theories, or could be at home in, or sometimes rejected by lots of different ethical theories. So it's not clear that like rights by themselves give us a full-fledged theory, though they could be like the centerpiece or an important notion or something. And we might test other theories, say utilitarianism or something like that, in terms of whether or not it grants people sufficient rights or it violates rights, willy-nilly or whatever. So there's a lot of information in the Allman piece and in the Sumner piece. So I'll just break down maybe like some things that I think are really interesting or important for us to think about. And then if you have any other questions, Dan, we could talk about that. Or, we could go on to our history, which, the history chapter we read this week, there's just loads of violations of rights or depriving people of rights or not recognizing rights, right? Whether that's legal or moral. So maybe that's a good starting point. One way you can think about rights is it's a kind of legal thing, right? And so if I'm in a certain society, well, the rights I am granted by that government might depend. They might differ. So in some places, right, in some places and in some times, if I'm a woman, I don't have the right to own property, or I don't have the right to open a bank account, or I don't have the right to vote or something, right? Or if I'm not a wealthy landed white man, or if I'm not a white man, right, then I also wouldn't have the legal right to vote. And so the way to think about legal rights is we might hope that they are somehow correlated with moral rights, but in many cases we might think the absence of some of those legal recognitions is a problem because people have something like a universal right or a moral right to a thing. And you can think of moral rights in different ways. One way to think about them is you can think about the idea generally that people have rights. And then you can think of specific kinds of rights, like do I have a right to bodily autonomy, or do I have a right to free speech, or something like that, right? Another way to think about and kind of analyze rights is to think about their structure. So rights usually have, Allman mentions this and Sumner discusses this too, the idea of a subject, like I have a right, if I have a right to, if I have a right to free speech, let's say, then I get to say all sorts of things, and that right, other people can't restrict me in a certain way, right? So that has a very clear subject. The content of that right is going to be my ability to speak freely or something. The object is a little less clear in that case, because it's not really to a single person. Lots of rights are like, I have a right to have my property returned if you borrow my property, right? This is an example Sumner uses. And then the object is you, but there are lots of other rights that are very general, and it's not clear there's a single individual subject, a single individual object, right? In the way that if I loan you my computer, I have a right to have it returned to me at a certain time, then you're the object of that right because I'm holding the claim of it against you. It's also the case that rights, you might think, have certain strengths. So it might be that some rights overpower others or override others because those rights are stronger than other rights. So think about the example of free speech. And this is maybe we're blurring a legal moral distinction here, but let's just go with it. So, I have the right to free speech, but that right can be overridden by, say, other people's right to like bodily integrity. So this is, again, kind of the legal and moral thing. I'm not supposed to yell fire in a crowded theater, right? And why? Because if people act on that, they might get harmed, there might be damage, and then my free speech has caused that significant harm and damage, so I can't do that, right? I get penalized for doing that. My right to do that is overridden. Or an example sometimes people will say is like, I have a right to bodily motion, so I can move myself around like I want, but as soon as I'm moving my hand and it hits your face, boom, something's gone wrong, right? You have a right to like bodily integrity or insecurity, and that right trumps my right to move my hand around or something like that, right? So you can think of rights in terms of their strength as connecting to other rights. Both Almond and Sumner talk about the idea that, do we even need rights language? Can we exhaust everything we need by talking just about, say, duties? And they both think, and I think the general consensus now is that doesn't really work. Rights, you need them because they just go beyond the duties that we have towards one another, right? In particular, the duties really focus on the idea of what Sumner calls, and what we will think about in this class as moral agents, which are individuals who can kind of morally reason and think and act, right? Whereas there might be individuals, whether that's animals or people with severe developmental disability or traumatic brain injury or other kinds of things, or that are legally stripped of those other kinds of rights, that are not able to be agents. And so we would consider that class would be kind of like moral patients. So a comatose person might have rights, and their rights protect them from being acted upon in a certain way, but they might not be a moral agent because, right, they're comatose, there's not stuff going on, or they're dreaming or whatever it is, right? And so rights are really focused on from the perspective of moral patients instead of moral agents, whereas that's really something that is more to duties. There are various kinds of rights. There are claim rights. What do I have a claim to? There are liberty rights. What am I free to do, right? And in those cases, I'm like free to do it or not do it. I'm not obliged in either way. There are certain kinds of rights that are immunities. I'm immune from, say, having to testify against a loved one or something like that. And there are also another way to think about rights is, I think it's really interesting, is to think about what Schaefer-Landau in our textbook will repeatedly refer to as the scope of the moral community, right? And so the idea there, and this dovetails very nicely, I think, with our history reading, is, you might think it is intuitive, it's natural in human moral development to have kind of if we imagine the moral community as a ring of concentric circles, our smallest circle on the inside is maybe just myself. If I'm like early in my development, I'm an egotist, right? That I'm thinking the only thing that matters is me, and the only moral thing to do is whatever works for me, right? And then you might extend it a little farther to, say, your family, right? Oh, okay, I can't just be selfish like I was when I was 2. I have to be kind and considerate to my sister, my brother, my father, my mother, a parent, right? An uncle, whatever. And then you might extend that farther out, and people have different stories about how you would do that, right? Maybe now I have to think about my friends, maybe then I have to think about my neighbors or my local community, and we can just kind of keep extending it, right? So one way to think about the question about this rights in relation to this idea of the scope of the moral community is, who has rights, and in virtue of what do they have them? So, in our history reading this week, what we saw was, even with, right, the North forcing the South to just outlaw slavery, it's not like they were automatically granting, right, freedmen a bunch of rights. Right? What they were doing is basically saying certain kinds of things are off limits, but we're still not extending everything. And in fact, a lot of the reaction, and Dan will speak of this more eloquently and more carefully than I do and will, a lot of the reaction to those white Southerners is to ensure that those people are not exercising certain rights, right? Or that those rights not be extended to them, that they can keep things in kind of the same pattern that worked for them, right? And so there's lots of disagreement about what would grant a person a right. So you might think that rights should be given to individuals on the basis of something like rationality, right? This is something that some contractarians, and also if your rights fit into a deontological theory like Kant's theory, you might think, yeah, that's what is most distinctive about human beings, is that we can reason and talk to each other, and that's what grants us rights, and any individual that can't do that, they just don't have rights. But of course, that means most animals will not have rights. Certainly infants will not have rights, and lots of human beings will end up not having rights there, right? And of course, certainly there will be no environmental rights or rights of ecosystems or plants or anything like that. You could, on the kind of other side of that scale, you could say rights really come from sentience, right? The ability to feel pleasure and pain, to respond to stimuli, and to have that qualitative experience of pain and pleasure. And then animals are going to turn out to have rights, as are probably infants, really probably most things except plants, although even then it might be that comatose people maybe don't have rights, or people who are anhedonic, right? There are those people who can't feel pain. It turns out it's a real problem for them. If they burn themselves or cut themselves, they don't notice it. It can be really damaging. But if they don't feel pain, and our requirement for rights is that you have that ability to feel pain and pleasure, they will be out of it, right? And so there's lots of disagreements about exactly how far should rights be extended, what is the list of rights that individuals have, and then of course, how do they, when they're in conflict, when my rights and your rights are in conflict, how do we navigate that? Are some of them stronger than others? Are some of them more fundamental or basic than others, etc.? And so one of the theories we will read about in this class, social contract theory or contractarianism, will say, well, the rights that are given to individuals are really the rights that contractors essentially agree to give to both the contractors and people outside of the contract that maybe don't have the force or ability, power, intelligence, whatever it is, to be a contractor in that context. The final thing I want to say about rights is, I think both Sumner and Almond are correct that rights are really, really ubiquitous. We use the term a lot. We think about it a lot. It's really important for us. It's been historically important. Thinking about, advances that over time women have made or that African Americans have made. Part of that has been, well, I want these rights recognized and the government isn't recognizing them. And that seems like I'm being treated unfairly or treated poorly or something, right? Something immoral about it. So rights language, even though there are critiques, right? I think Almond talked about this in Sumner too. You could have critiques of rights from just about any political position, right? There are conservative critiques of rights that it doesn't take into account the culture and community enough. It's too individualistic. You could have kind of left-leaning critiques of rights, right? That they are, again, too individualistic. It's really more about, say, a dialectical historical process, or in the context of, say, like a feminist critique, you might think rights are too individual focused, and what we really want for morality is like, we want trust and love and care, and those things go beyond and certainly exhaust the notion of rights that I can assert against a person or something, right? So even though there are these questions about rights, they're a really important moral notion. And the other interesting thing about them is, as a moral notion, they are not themselves, the idea of rights is not by itself, at least, a theory, right? And so one thing we might try to do is think about, if we think rights are a really important moral notion, how do we make room for them, and how do they connect to the moral theories that we'll read about in the class, like deontology or Kantianism, like consequentialism or utilitarianism, or like social contract theory? Do rights have a place in virtue theory? Do they have a place in feminist theory? These are all good questions that we'll keep in mind as we go forward.
Yeah, I think like an important element too is enforcement of the rights. Mm-hmm. So a moral right might exist, but it can't be enforced. Or you can enforce certain rights. I always think of people starving versus property rights.
Yeah.
So your rights of property within certain societies are going to outweigh the moral right of feeding people.
Yeah, of people. Yeah, so there might be like a right to food or a right to sustenance or something like that. And those are cases where, like, at least as legally enshrined and as practice, people take those property rights to be more important and to trump those other rights.
Yeah, and I think this is a good sort of segue into the chapter where, in the aftermath of the Civil War, you have the pardoning of Confederates, and then you have that, I think it's basically the wealthy Confederates have to actually go to Johnson. Yeah.
But most of them got it, right? I was reading today that, what is it, like out of 15,000, 13,500 got it or something like that?
Yeah, like basically everyone's pardoned.
Everyone that he didn't actively distrust individually, basically it's like, sure.
Yeah, but immediately upon, the post-civil right or Civil War era, you have the rise of black codes, which are, essentially like a push to, create the structure of slavery outside the language
of legal
slavery, right? And then you have the 13th Amendment, which, kind of in conjunction with black codes, because I think one of the kind of common black codes exist in different ways or different forms across different states, but one of the common is the idea of vagrancy, and vagrancy can be, it can be applied to anyone walking around. Yeah. And so, and again, that 13th Amendment allows sort of the criminalization. Once you're criminalized, you can now be enslaved, and
That's right.
It's sort of
forced to
it's
do
the
labor.
loophole.
Yeah.
The other part too is the 14th Amendment, and I think as we'll go on, we'll take note of this, but as we discussed in the class version of this, the classroom version of it, it's with the 14th Amendment in terms of rights of citizens, a vast majority of cases protected corporations versus African Americans, which ostensibly the 14th Amendment was created to do.
Right. Yeah.
And again, it's that rights exist, but how are they enforced, and who's putting who's putting the power behind the enforcement? Who's
ensuring that individuals can exercise those rights? Exactly.
Yeah. The other important part of this too, and we see this throughout the Red Dead game, right? The post-Civil War era of Southern rights beginning to articulate like an anti-government rhetoric.
Yeah.
And really, that's against sort of the federal occupation of the South.
Yeah.
Beginning to redefine the war. Right. This is when the war, ignoring the Southern sort of Constitution, the secessionist.
Yeah.
That we're protecting slavery.
Yeah.
But instead, we're protecting states' rights against.
I object to federalism.
Federal intervention.
Yeah.
Right. So it is sort of this old relationships, new language.
Yeah.
This is the era too when you have growing labor demands as industrialization's happening.
Mm-hmm.
You have Republican tariffs, right, blocking out competition. Companies are making pretty good profits, but again, it's the wages of laborers are not keeping up with sort of...
The employees and the laborers are the ones that are feeling the negative effects of that.
And so you have a growing class conflict. And again, you see this in the game at various points.
Yeah.
Right, and then you also have, if the South is, and this, especially after 1877 when Reconstruction is just gutted and it ends. In the North, you have voters that are also uneasy about giving black people the right to vote.
Yeah.
Right, so this, the North might be different, but it's not the utopia.
That's right.
And then the West sort of exists in this other, stage at this point.
In this middle space, this lawless third space almost.
And
but that's the image or the myth or the idea.
So the other part of the 14th Amendment too is it doesn't protect Native Americans, right? And so there's that sort of this idea of, in this sense, it's Native Americans as not citizens, right?
Yeah,
I want to say that Native Americans don't quote become citizens until well into the 20th century.
Yeah.
You also have the unfolding of the Homestead Act, 1862, but it's people are taking advantage of it, right? Post Civil War era. Again, this sort of push to get population into the West and to get across the continent. Finance, trying to get railroads built, connect the two ends, and open up Chinese trade.
That's right, yeah. So can you tell me a little more about why there was such a push to get the population of, again, the United States, right, out into the West? Because part of what we think in the kind of popular conception of this history is just, well, look, it's free real estate. It's land out there. Someone's just got to get up the gumption and take it or whatever, right? But of course, the historical and socio-political reality is a little more complicated than that. So what was from the kind of governmental perspective or societal perspective, what was the focus on the push of getting people to go out in masses and settle the Western area?
Well, I mean, it's sort of, the safety valve of labor in the East. The idea is if within the sort of traditional European immigration, you arrive to the United States, you sort of work in these, kind of bad factory conditions, and then you figure out a way to save up or whatever, and you get out west and get your own farm.
I see.
Right, and so there's that aspect too. But I also,
there's this kind of international aspect.
Yeah, the international part is, right, what happened to Mexico with... Mexico didn't have the population push to move up into what becomes the United States West, right?
Yeah.
Where, most of the West was, a part of Mexico until the Mexican-American War.
Yeah.
And so that's a lesson that I think the United States understood. The other part, too, is the more, quote, settlers that go out, the faster and you can appropriate land from indigenous people.
Yeah.
And you can,
you call the army in or the government.
Yeah, you can justify, military relocation, ethnic cleansing, basically, to clear out areas.
Yeah.
And create conditions that had been unfolding since, the post-revolutionary era. It picks up, obviously, with the Indian Removal Act in 1830s. So you have all these different things. But again, China is still, this is, I think 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, China is always, right, the target.
Mm-hmm.
Can we get into the markets of China? And so getting, a network infrastructure across the continent is really important.
Yeah, imperative.
So the other part that Richardson talks about are these treaties that come about. And I think last week we spoke a bit about, indigenous groups that join the South, definitely get punished in the aftermath. And so there's various treaties that, again, appropriate lands. What is it? She says something along the lines of, the Treaty of Medicine Lodge, 1867, near Medicine Lodge, Kansas.
Yeah.
Led to the Kiowa, Comanche, Apache, Cheyenne, and Arapaho Indians to exchange their claim of 90 million acres of their traditional lands for confirmation of their title to around 3 million acres in what is now Oklahoma.
Yeah.
Right. And then obviously later on those Oklahoma lands
get taken again.
Get taken away.
Well, and maybe compressed as well. And
Yeah. And so really a big part of this is, right, trying to, make sure that railroad crews are not bothered, and then stop raiding forts and that sort of thing. There's the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868 in the Northern Plains. Right, it gave the Sioux the Black Hills Reservation in the Dakotas forever, until there's minerals that are found there, and
it's
then
like forever asterisk.
Yeah, and then that becomes, right, an issue.
Yeah,
and throughout this whole, all these negotiations, tribes are all, they're divided over accepting, these conditions.
Yeah.
And then probably, one of the worst aspects is the idea that you have Indian agents controlling tribes. So it's you lose absolute sovereignty and autonomy.
Yeah.
You lose absolute rights, really. Like you become a dependent on the federal government.
Yeah.
The other part too, and I think it's important to think about this as we're playing the game, and this is really it's from Limerick, The Legacy of Conquest.
Yeah.
But in talking about how we think about the West, right? Because Red Dead takes place almost in the 20th century, but it is the West, and arguably you would play the game because you want to do a simulation of the West.
Of the Old West.
Of the Old West. And we'll get into that.
Gunslingers at high noon.
Yeah, so we'll get into, later on with a different book about, a lot of this stuff should be taking place in the 1870s.
Yeah.
But you're making a game and you're trying to pack everything into one place.
Yeah, just like we compress the geographic map, then we compress the time scale.
You got to compress the time scale a bit too.
Can't play the game for 30 years, or maybe you could, but right.
Yeah, and a part of this, there's a great paragraph in here on page 19 where she writes, in the popular imagination, the reality of conquest dissolved into stereotypes of noble savages and noble pioneers struggling quaintly in the wilderness. These adventures seem to have no bearing on the complex realities of 20th century America. And again, these are the popular imagination. This is really 20th century, thing.
Yeah.
And so this is sort of, radio, eventually television, early film, the golden age of Hollywood, right, that sort of thing. In Western paintings, novels, movies, television shows, those stereotypes were valued precisely because they offered an escape from modern troubles.
Yeah.
The subject of slavery was the domain of serious scholars and the occasion for sober national reflection, right? And she's kind of creating a separation between slavery and really settler colonialism, right? Which is that westward expansion. Yeah. The subject of conquest, right? Moving westwards expansion, was the domain of mass entertainment and the occasion for lighthearted national escapism. An element of regret for, quote, what we did to the Indians, end quote, had entered the picture, but the dominant feature of conquest remained adventure, which literally is the game. That's why you would play the game.
Yeah.
Right? Children happily played, quote, cowboys and Indians, end quote, but stopped short of playing masters and slaves. Yeah. Right? And this kind of goes back to that discussion of rights, because
absolutely.
The morality, why is the morality of one where cowboys and Indians becomes sort of this early childhood
game you play.
It's a war game for kids versus the master and slave that would be completely off, right? No one plays that game.
That's right.
Right. What do you think of that in terms of these discussion of rights? And one is recognized. I mean, the fact that it's not played, it's recognized as a crime against humanity.
That's right.
You wouldn't play that. Yeah. But the other one has that romantic adventure.
Yeah. So I think, and this is, I guess, just my kind of immediate reaction, and I might get some stuff wrong here, but the way that I would think about it is kind of like, first of all, as the Limerick quote notes, there's just kind of a different attitude, even during this time, at least among large swaths of people, towards the history of the United States in terms of slavery versus the history of the United States in terms of Native Americans, American Indians, and stuff, right? The other reason I think that sometimes when you're thinking about this in the context of rights or moral behavior, why would we play one and not the other? Well, again, in popular imagination, in books, and how this is depicted in movies, Indians are often depicted, right, regardless of how connected to history this actually is, as agents. They have agents who have power and are dangerous and can hurt us, right? And of course, the cowboy is supposed to be the figure that's more kind of, I guess, on our side or whatever, that can do something about it. But it's almost at least again, in this ideal way, these struggle between equals. In the same way that this is not the same thing exactly, right? But thinking of cops and robbers. Robbers, even though they're criminals, are agents that have the power to harm and destroy, the same way that cops also have that power, right? But you have something master and slave, and almost by definition, an individual who is enslaved does not have agency. They've been stripped of that agency and stuff, right? And so the other, to put on my, I guess, amateur psychologist or sociologist hat or whatever, is presumably there's something about conflict that is different for children, especially, than something like just abject domination, right? So if I'm playing cops and robbers, then it's your team versus my team, but we're kind of on the same level. Or even cowboys and Indians, it's we're on the same level. We can both harm each other. We both have weaponry and advantages and disadvantages and stuff. There is no similar competitive structure to master and slave, because that enslaved person, almost by definition of that hierarchical position, does not have agency or power. And ideally wouldn't be the source of danger, although of course that is also part of this. Is the story is, when all of these people, when this, the yellow fever comes through, and that's causing a bunch of people to die, the first people they blame are, it's these black people that are causing us to get sick, right? And so, and why might slavery be justified? Well, maybe it's for their own good, the same way moving the Indians out is for their own good, but the other way you might do it is, well, they're dangerous and we have to restrain them to save ourselves, to save our women folk or whatever, right? And so even then the danger becomes like the justification for stripping these rights away from people and leaving them in incredibly awful positions, selling their family, right? Killing them, maiming them, all of the things that happen.
Yeah, and I think we'll be getting into this later on, a couple more graduate readings. But there's a level of innocence, right? Like, so when you situate sort of the settler versus the Native American, or cowboys and Indians, right? There's an equivalency of power.
Yeah, or at least a supposed one or something.
And it's a fair fight, and then there's the victor, right, who is sort of the white settler, and that's easier to justify at the end result, right? So the debate over, appropriation of land, right, ethnic cleansing, massacres, all these different things that are, in history, an innocence sort of hovers over it because, well, it was a fair fight, right? It's sort of this, which is very American, right? It's the treacherous, the treacherous ambush.
Yeah.
Right.
I wonder if there's also maybe a little bit of Darwinian stuff going on too. Like, how do I justify it? Well, it's natural selection, survival of the fittest, right?
Yeah.
We were just more fit or something, even though that also is not accurate. Also, not even the right appropriation of that kind of biological
it's more the Spencer.
Exactly.
Yeah, so
the social Darwinist kind of stuff,
and that coincides too. I mean, in this. One of the more interesting parts of the game, that the eugenicist, right, downtown Saint Denis.
Yeah.
Spencer, ideas of Spencer appropriating Darwin, and then that is directly woven into sort of eugenics, right? Ideas of eugenics and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, for this week, the chapter was relatively short. The rights readings are it's I think as students are reading, this isn't easy.
It's not. That's right. Yeah.
It's
and part of that, to be clear, part of that is, in a certain sense, I would say my fault. And what I mean by that is, this is there are grad students taking the course. Yeah. It's listed, I think, as 300 in history, but it's like a 490 philosophy course. And so we have a textbook that is the textbook. As you'll read it, you'll notice that some of our readings are at very different levels. So both of these readings are from basically big companions or anthologies to ethical theory or ethical concepts. And so those are written to some extent for interested students, but also for graduate students or for other people in the field who maybe just, I haven't read this in a while, let me kind of catch up on some stuff, right? And so we'll also read, as the course goes on, we will read stuff from journal articles. I mean, even these particular chapters are peer-reviewed and intentionally written, right, for an audience of people who at least know some stuff about it. So yeah, it is definitely hard. You'll notice that when we get back to the Schaeffer-Landau, or at least I hope you notice, that it's a little easier reading and a little smoother. It's also kind of broken down in a little more of a simplistic way. When we have these readings, and you'll notice in the graduate readings, some of that is like a little more complicated, right? A little more complex. And it is just, I think we talked about this last time, and I know you and I have discussed this, and you've heard me just kind of say this and maybe complain about it. And you can even go back to the first readings of von Kriegstein and Regan, right? Philosophy is just not always something people are used to reading. We're used to reading from just K through 12, right? From our early education, we're used to reading poetry and literature, and we're used to reading probably not like, the Western Appomattox level history, but we're used to reading some stuff about history. We're used to maybe some math, maybe science, biology or something. But unless you were in a religious school or a private school, you probably didn't have a lot of exposure to read a bunch of philosophy, right? And so it is just something that for many students is foreign. I know we have some students in this class, this is the first time they've ever taken a philosophy class, right? So I would encourage you, if you're having trouble, of course, you always reach out to us, communicate with us, we're happy to help. But also, there are some readings that I posted as a separate module that are just how do I read philosophy articles and how do I engage in philosophical conversation? And part of why I include those is not because I think anyone is not smart enough to read it or anything like that. It's just I've been teaching philosophy for over a decade now, And just a handful of years ago, I started using those, and students just multiple times, they were like, those were super helpful, right? And so if you're not having trouble, great, and that's great. But if you are having trouble, like, please feel free to look at those resources and ask us questions. Send us an email. We're still, I think, kind of working out. We have office hours, but we're thinking about some additional office hours. So we're always happy to talk with you. But it is just kind of hard. And, even for me, I mean, I have a PhD, and I've been doing this for years, and I've published in peer-reviewed journals. And it is still hard for me. I still reread some of this stuff multiple times because I'm like, oh, I didn't quite track that. Or, oh, what do they mean by that? Like,
yeah, I think the thing that throws, there's a culture of math within this very deep,
a lot of definitions, a lot of axioms.
Yeah, and so it's like A plus B equals C, and then but it's I guess the closest oddness as I'm reading it is reading turn of the century writing.
Okay.
Like like Du Bois' Souls of Black Folk. Like,
okay,
when you're reading that, it's not familiar. The language is not familiar.
There's a real unfamiliarity to it.
And so
100%.
It's almost like, it's like watching a movie with Scottish accents, and like, it's hard to understand it at first, and eventually your brain starts going, oh, that's what
starts tracking it. Mm-hmm.
And I the same way with a lot of that turn of the century writing, it's the culture of writing is unfamiliar to sort of contemporary. And philosophy definitely has. I mean, it's one thing to read Plato, like I taught a class with Plato and Confucius.
The dialogues, or the anorexia,
and I think I could approach that because I could see it in its time, and it was easier to get into it.
Yeah.
But I think what's I think difficult, especially if you're unfamiliar, is just the aesthetic. Yeah. The aesthetic of laying out sort of the arguments. You can't just glance through these readings.
That's right.
You definitely need to sit down and
take some
have
time.
A chunk of time.
Yep. 100%.
Put some notes. Take some notes as you're reading.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. And I think you would obviously agree. But if you do that and you're weaving it in with the history, and you're playing the game and you're taking those three things and putting them into dialogue, the class will be very dynamic for you.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think, I think everything that you said there is correct. I would say, for me, like going back and reading West from Epimatics, because we taught this class before and I read it then, but I'm going back through it now and I'm trying to sort of pay attention to it even more so and kind of refresh myself. And I think for me, one of the things that really stuck out to me was, and I think this is maybe a way to think about this is like, for good or ill, right? The philosophy reading is often taking place at a level of relative abstraction, right? Doesn't mean there are never examples given or whatever, but it's like we're going to think about the concept of rights very broadly or generally. We're going to think about how it might apply both legally, maybe in history, but also just in general, and then we can kind of dive down to specific situations or people or nations or whatever. And the thing I really enjoyed about the Western Mathematics chapter this week was it is so detailed and is so packed with information of a specific time and how it's connected to all this other stuff. I really, really enjoyed that. But it is very different than how most of the philosophy writing is going to be. You'll see Schaefer-Landau will give you particular cases and examples, but a lot of it is operating at a level of like principles and arguments that are pretty generalizable. And I think that is just a kind of different approach, right? And so we kind of hope, and I, at least certainly speaking for myself, one thing that I enjoyed about this when we did it, and I'm enjoying about it again, is I'm getting to learn stuff from you, right? I'm getting to learn stuff from these authors that I don't really know hardly anything about, or that I haven't taken a class on in a long time, or, I'm pretty sure when I first started playing Red Dead, I was just like, wow, this is really historically accurate. Mm-hmm. And then reading and learning about it, it's like, oh, well, in some cases maybe, in a lot of cases not, right? So we're getting, what you're getting in this class is you're really getting an experience of like history scholarship and like how a historian would try to focus on answering this question. You're getting kind of what would a philosopher from kind of like Western, what's sometimes now called analytic philosophy, right? The philosophy mostly practiced in the UK and the United States. How would they approach some of these topics? And then how do we connect it together in an example like the game, which is so dynamic and so engaging, and just you just dive into it. I spent, I had kind of I wouldn't say a fugue state, but I started playing this past weekend, and then I looked up and like way more time had passed than I thought, because I was just like immersed in it, right? And so we hope that part of what this class does is really help you think about this from a variety of different perspectives, and bring those perspectives to each other. So I know that when Dr. McClure and I have talked about some of these topics before, sometimes he's really helpful for me in bringing to bear, like, how do we think about the specific historical patterns that relate to this, or the specific kind of historical circumstances that, say, some of these philosophers were in when they first wrote it 200 years ago or whatever, right? And for me, when I'm reading some of the history stuff, when we're talking, I'm thinking, okay, but how does this argument or theory, how would it apply to this particular case, right? And so, we hope that what you're getting is this kind of really interesting interdisciplinary, cross-fertilized thing, all wrapped up in also you got to play a video game several hours a week. So I think that's all we have for today. So we hope that you will join us again next week. We hope you're enjoying the readings and getting stuff out of it. And we hope that you're enjoying traveling with Arthur and Dutch and the rest of the Van der Linde gang and Red Dead Redemption 2.
See you next week.